I have led millions in prayer, but for 50 years, I was talking to a ceiling of stone while my heart turned to ash. I have stood at the center of the world, draped in the finest silks, surrounded by the scent of expensive oud and the reverent whispers of the faithful, yet I was a walking graveyard. My name is Sheikh Abbas. I am 58 years old, and for most of my life, I was one of the most powerful religious figures in Mecca. To the world, I was a pillar of the faith, a shadow of truth, whose voice echoed through the marble corridors of the holy city. But behind the prestige, I was a prisoner of a gilded cage. I lived a life of exhausting performance, a relentless cycle of legalism where every breath was measured by its adherence to a law that offered no life. I was a professional at piety, and mastering the art of the downward gaze and the rhythmic chanting of verses I felt only in my throat, never in my soul. I was a man of immense influence, yet I felt like a total fraud. I watched the pilgrims weep at the Kaaba, and I felt a bitter envy, because they still had hope, while I had only the cold, dry certainty of ritual. I grew up in the shadow of the minarets, the son of a scholar, trained from birth to be the vessel of an ancient tradition. I knew the weight of every syllable of the law, but I never knew the warmth of a father's embrace. My house was filled with servants and scholars, yet it was the loneliest place on earth. My wives looked at me with fear, not love, and my sons looked at me as a ladder to their own ambitions. I was 58, and I was ready to die simply because I was tired of pretending that the dry bread of my religion was a feast. I spent my days issuing fatwas and my nights staring at the ornate carvings on my ceiling, wondering if God was even listening, or if he was as tired of me as I was of myself. The void inside me was so vast that it felt like a physical weight, a crushing pressure in my chest that no amount of fasting or prayer could alleviate. I was a ghost in a grand robe. Before I tell you how the light finally broke into my darkness, I want to ask you to do something. If you feel like you are performing a role, if your soul is starving in the midst of religious plenty, please subscribe to this channel and like this video. Comment your story below. Sharing these testimonies is how we reach the hearts currently trapped in the shadows and help us spread this light to the ends of the earth. I stood one evening looking out over the courtyard of the great mosque, watching the thousands circle like a white whirlpool. I realized then that I was a guide who was utterly lost. I had the map, but I had never seen the destination. I was the keeper of the keys, but I was locked out of the room. I felt a sudden sharp hunger for something real, not a law, not a ritual, but a presence. I didn't know then that the presence was already seeking me. I didn't know that my 50 years of performance were about to come to a crashing, beautiful end. I was 58 years old, and for the first time in my life, I was willing to be empty so that I could finally be filled. It was the holiest month, the month of Ramadan, but for me, it was a season of profound despair. The heat of the Saudi sun was nothing compared to the scorching dryness of my own spirit. As I stood to lead the prayers, the words felt like sand in my mouth. I found myself reciting verses that I had memorized as a child, but now they felt like accusations. I encountered passages that spoke of a peace I had never touched, a mercy that seemed reserved for everyone but the man speaking the words. Every night of fasting left me more hollow, not more holy. My crisis of faith reached its breaking point, not in a library, but in a quiet room within the religious complex. I witnessed an act of staggering corruption among the elite. Men I had called brothers, men who used the name of the Almighty to hide their own greed and thirst for power. I saw them trade influence for gold, and I saw them mock the very pilgrims who looked to them for salvation. It shattered the last pillar of my trust in the system I led. I realized then that we were not guardians of a holy truth. We were guards of a hollow temple, protecting our own status while the people starved for God. That night, The weight of the hypocrisy became unbearable. I felt like the very marble of Mecca was sweating with the weight of our lies. I retreated to my private quarters, locked the heavy oak doors, and fell to the floor, my forehead pressed against the cold stone. I did not use the formal Arabic of the scholars. I did not perform the wudu. I just groaned. I wept alone in the dark, begging for a God I did not yet know. If you are real, I whispered into the silk of my prayer rug, find me. Because the one I have served for 50 years is silent, and I am dying. The month of fasting had become a fast of the soul, and I was starving for something that could actually satisfy. I thought of the millions who looked to me as their shepherd, and I felt a wave of nausea. I was a blind man, leading the blind into a pit. I spent the remaining nights of Ramadan in a state of mourning. I mourned for my lost years, for my father's expectations, and for the man I was supposed to be. I felt the judgment of the city pressing in on me, but more than that, I felt the judgment of my own heart. I was a Grand Imam who no longer believed in the God of the Imams. I was a man standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for a wind to push me over. I had reached the end of my strength, the end of my wisdom, and the end of my religion. I was ready for anything, even the end of my life, and if it meant I would no longer have to live this lie. Little did I know that the night of power was coming, and it would bring a power that would rewrite my entire existence. During Laylat al-Qadr, the night of power, the heavens finally answered, but not in the way I had been taught to expect. I was in a state of deep exhaustion, a trance-like fatigue that blurred the lines between waking and dreaming. I had been praying for hours, not the formal prayers, but the desperate cries of a drowning man. Suddenly the walls of my room seemed to dissolve, and I was standing before the Kaaba. But it was not the black draped stone I knew. The structure began to split open, the heavy silk tearing like paper in a storm. I expected darkness or a terrifying judgment to pour out, but instead, the most blinding, impure light I have ever seen erupted from the center. It was a light that didn't just shine, it spoke. And there, standing in the midst of the radiance, was a man. He wore a simple white robe, but the light seemed to emanate from within his very skin. He moved toward me with a grace that silenced the universe. I fell to my knees, shielding my eyes from the brilliance, but he reached out. When I saw his hands, my heart stopped. They were pierced. Deep, jagged marks were etched into his wrists, and I could see the scars on his feet. He didn't look at me with the stern judgment of the law. He looked at me with a compassion that felt like it was physically healing the decades of depression in my heart. His eyes were like fire, but they didn't burn me. They warmed me. He spoke, and his voice was like the sound of many waters, yet as intimate as a whisper in my ear. "Abbas," he said, "why do you seek the living among the dead?" The peace that flooded my being in that moment was visceral, a supernatural warmth that replaced the cold ash in my chest. It was as if 50 years of heavy stones were suddenly lifted from my shoulders. I knew who he was. My spirit recognized him before my mind could find the words. I knew the man with the scarred hands. I saw in his face the answer to every question I had ever asked. He was not a distant judge. He was the truth I had been searching for in the dry scrolls of my youth. I reached out to touch the hem of his robe, and I felt a power like electricity surge through my body. The great void was gone. In its place was a river of living water. I woke up on my rug, gasping for air, my face wet with tears that were no longer bitter. The name was burned into my mind like a brand of fire. Isa. Jesus. I sat there in the silence of the night, the room still smelling of the oud he had brought with him. I realized that the night of power had truly come, but it wasn't the power of the sword or the state. It was the power of a love that had descended into my hell to pull me out. I was 58 years old, and for the first time, I was not afraid of the dark. The light of that man stayed in my eyes, making the ornate gold of my room look like cheap tin. I had seen the king, and I could never bow to a shadow again. I realized that my entire life had been a preparation for this one moment of surrender. I was a child again, standing at the beginning of a vast, beautiful world. I whispered his name over and over into the darkness, and each time I said it, in a new layer of my old self fell away. Isa, Isa, Isa. I was no longer the Grand Imam of Mecca. I was a man who had been found by the shepherd. I began a secret, dangerous journey into the forbidden. Using a hidden device and a secure connection, I found the New Testament. I spent my nights huddled in the dark, my heart racing as I read the words of the Injil. I started with the Sermon on the Mount, and the contrast was a seismic shock to my system. For 50 years, I had enforced a law of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a cycle of retribution that never ended, a machine of justice that had no room for the heart. But here was a king who commanded, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." I dropped my phone in shock. These words were not just beautiful, and they were a direct assault on the world I had built. It was a mental rebirth. I realized that my entire identity, my prestige, my titles, my lineage, was nothing but a shroud. I was not a Grand Imam. I was a child who had finally found his father. I learned that I didn't have to earn his love through the exhausting performance of the 5 prayers or the heavy burden of legalism. He had already earned my freedom on a cross. I spent hours comparing the verses I had memorized with the words of Jesus. Every time I found a contradiction, my heart leapt with joy. The law said do, but grace said done. The law demanded my blood, but Jesus gave his. I felt like a man who had lived in a cave his whole life and was suddenly standing on a mountain peak. The struggle was intense, and the weight of my secret felt like a mountain on my back during the day. I would stand in the pulpit, looking out at the thousands of faces, and I wanted to scream the truth. I wanted to tell them that the God they were trying to please was already in love with them. I was no longer a servant of a law. I was a son of the living God. But the fear of the cost kept my lips sealed, even as the fire in my bones grew hotter every day. I began to see the Quranic contradictions not as academic puzzles, but as the bars of the cage I had just escaped. I read about the woman caught in adultery and how Jesus offered her life instead of stones. I wept for the women I had judged and the men I had condemned. I realized that I had been a Pharisee, a man who loved the law more than the people the law was meant to serve. My secret Bible app became my most precious possession. I would hide it under my pillows, feeling its presence like a pulse. I was 58, and I was relearning everything I thought I knew. I was an old man becoming a new creation. I felt a strange, terrifying freedom. I knew that I couldn't keep this secret forever. The truth was too big for my chest. It was growing, expanding, threatening to burst out of me in the middle of a Friday sermon. I was walking through the streets of Mecca, and I felt like I was walking on air, even as I knew the ground was preparing to swallow me. Whispers began to circulate. News of my strange behavior, the way I paused during the prayers, the new softness in my voice, my sudden lack of interest in the political power of the council, began to leak into the halls of Riyadh. I could feel the atmosphere shifting around me, the way my fellow imams looked at me with a mixture of confusion and growing suspicion. But I wasn't the only one. In the digital shadows, through encrypted channels and hidden forums, I found a secret protest of the soul. Among the youth of Saudi Arabia, I discovered a hidden community of believers who were also disillusioned by the dry husks of our tradition. They weren't protesting for politics, they were protesting for life. I found myself in a chat group with students, soldiers, and even a young woman who had been a teacher in Medina. They spoke of visions of the man in white. They spoke of the peace that the world couldn't give. I realized then that I wasn't an isolated case. I was part of a tidal wave of the spirit. The moral conflict of my public role became a daily agony. How could I continue to lead the millions in a direction my heart had already abandoned? I was a man of the cloth, but my heart was already on the cross. Every Friday, the walk to the pulpit felt like a walk to the gallows. I would see the Secret Service officers standing at the back of the mosque, their eyes scanning the crowd. I knew they were also scanning me. Pacing through my gardens at night, I felt the invisible eyes of the state on me. They were watching, waiting for a slip, a sign of the madness or the Western infection they suspected was taking root in the Grand Imam. I realized that the freedom of my spirit was leading me directly toward the cage of the state. Yet for the first time in my 58 years, I felt truly dangerous to the kingdom of darkness. I was no longer a puppet. I was a witness. I started to use my sermons to drop subtle hints of grace. I spoke of the heart's need for mercy rather than just obedience. I saw the faces of the young people light up, and I saw the brows of the elders darken. I was walking a tightrope over a lake of fire. I communicated with the hidden church, giving them the encouragement that only someone in my position could offer. We were a network of light under a blanket of shadows. The tension was building like a summer storm over the desert. I knew that the transition from a hidden faith to a public confession was inevitable. I felt a strange urgency, as if the Holy Spirit were pushing me toward a climax I couldn't escape. I was 58, and I was ready to trade my throne for a cell if it meant I could speak his name out loud. The secret protests were growing, not in the streets, but in the quiet corners of hearts across the peninsula. We were the 7,000 who had not bowed the knee. I felt the strength of their prayers surrounding me like a shield of gold. The backlash began at home, where the shadows are always longest. My eldest son, a man of high standing in the government and a staunch defender of our family's reputation, confronted me in my private study. It was a Judas kiss moment, the ultimate betrayal masked as concern. He didn't come with a blade, but with words that were meant to bleed me dry. "Father, you are destroying us," he hissed, his face pale with a mixture of fear and fury. He had found the hidden device. He had seen the bookmarks in the New Testament. It wasn't just about the religion to him. It was about our survival in the Saudi social structure. He spoke of the assets that would be seized, the shame that would follow my name, and the danger to his own career. He threatened to declare me insane, to have me committed to a psychiatric facility where I would be silenced forever. He spoke of the shame culture, the absolute pariah status our entire family would suffer if I didn't return to the fold and perform a public act of repentance. I stood there watching the son I had raised, a man I had taught to be a defender of the faith. My heart broke for him. He was a prisoner of the same fear that had governed me for 5 decades. This was the agony of choice. On one side was my son, my comfort, my family's safety, and the legacy of my ancestors. On the other was the man with the scarred hands. I realized that my love for Christ had to be greater than my love for my own blood. I looked at him with a pity that only enraged him further. Fatemeh, my wife, stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with a terror I could almost taste. She didn't understand the light. She only saw the darkness of the consequences. "Abbas," she whispered, "please, for the children." I felt the weight of her plea like a physical blow, but I knew that I couldn't go back to the lie. You cannot unsee the sun once you have stood in its warmth. I told my son that I had found the truth, and that the truth had a name. He spat at my feet, a gesture of absolute rejection that severed 25 years of fatherhood. He told me that I was dead to him, and that he would be the one to sign the warrant for my arrest if I didn't recant by morning. The silence that followed his departure was the heaviest I have ever known. I was a man who had built a kingdom of sand, and now the tide was coming in. I sat in the darkness, praying for my family, realizing that to follow Jesus was to walk the path of total rejection. I was an old man losing his world, but I felt the King standing right beside me in the gloom. On a Friday that would change the course of my life, I took my place at the minaret for the noon prayer. The heat was shimmering off the marble of the great mosque, and the crowd was a vast white sea of millions. I could feel the eyes of the Secret Service on me, and I could see my son standing near the front, his face a mask of iron. I didn't use the prepared text of the scholars. I didn't speak of the law. I stood before the microphone, my heart beating with a rhythm that wasn't my own. After the traditional opening, I paused, and the silence stretched across the square, heavy and expectant. Then, I spoke of the Prince of Peace. I didn't incite a riot. I simply testified to the vision I had seen on the night of power. I spoke of a God who doesn't want our blood to satisfy his justice, but who gave his own blood to satisfy his love. I spoke of Isa, the man with the scarred hands, the one who heals the brokenhearted and sets the captives free. A terrifying silence fell over the millions. You could hear the desert wind whistling through the speakers. I saw the shock on the faces of the imams behind me, and I saw the confusion in the eyes of the pilgrims. I told them that the search for God doesn't end in a stone building, but at the foot of a cross. I told them that I, their Grand Imam, had been found by the truth. I was forcibly removed before I could finish, and hands grabbed my robes, dragging me away from the microphone. My son was the first to reach me, his eyes filled with a hatred that was almost holy in its intensity. But as they dragged me through the corridors, I felt a joy that was almost laughter. The seed was sown. The words were in the air, and they could never be taken back. I heard later that day that spontaneous protests broke out, not for political change, not for money, but for the freedom to know the truth I had just proclaimed. The Grand Imam had spoken a forbidden name, and the desert began to tremble with the footfalls of seekers. I was no longer the shadow of truth. I was a witness to the light. As the heavy doors of the security van slammed shut, I looked out through the bars and saw a young man in the crowd. He was weeping, and he was smiling. He made the sign of the cross over his heart. I realized then that my 50 years of performance were worth this one moment of public confession. I was 58, and I had finally done something that mattered for eternity. They could take my life, but they could never take the words I had released into the hearts of the people. The King had arrived in Mecca, and he wasn't leaving. I felt the peace of Christ surrounding me like a fortress as we drove away from the mosque. I was a prisoner of the state, but I was the only free man in the city. I was taken to a high-security facility, a place of shadows and steel located deep beneath the city. I was stripped of my fine robes, my turban, and my dignity. I was held for questioning by a council of my former peers, men who had once looked to me for guidance, and men who had sat at my table and called me brother. This was my spiritual trial, a theater of shadows where the law met the spirit. They accused me of apostasy, of being a victim of sorcery, or of being a puppet of Western intelligence. They used every psychological trick in their arsenal to break my resolve. They spoke of the shame I was bringing to the holy city and the danger I was posing to the stability of the kingdom. They offered me everything to recant. My titles would be restored, my wealth doubled, and I would be given a quiet retirement in a luxury palace in Europe. All I had to do was say that I had been sick, that the vision was a hallucination. But I didn't answer them with anger or theological debate. I answered them with the words of the one who stood with me in the cell. I spoke of the joy that no prison could contain and the peace that the world could never give. My supernatural peace confused them. They expected a man broken by fear, a man begging for his life. Instead, they found a man who had already died to the world and was therefore beyond the reach of their threats. I realized that my downfall in their eyes was actually my greatest promotion in the kingdom. I was no longer a leader of men. I was a witness for the truth. One of the older scholars, a man I had known for 40 years, leaned in and whispered, "Abbas, why are you doing this? Is your life worth a dream?" I looked him in the eye and said, "My life was a dream before, a dream of dust. Now, I am finally awake." They didn't understand. They couldn't. To them, God was a set of rules to be managed. To me, He was a person to be loved. I spent my hours in the cell praying for them, for the men who were interrogating me. I saw the cracks in their armor, the fear in their own eyes. They were guarding a grave and they knew it. I felt the presence of Isa in that room more clearly than I had ever felt it in the great mosque. He was the fourth man in the fire. He was the one who gave me the words to speak and the strength to stay silent when needed. I realized that the lion's den was not a place of defeat, but a place of testimony. My 58 years of religious training were being stripped away, leaving only the raw, beautiful reality of faith. I was not afraid of the judgment of men, because I had already been accepted by the judge of the world. The final confrontation happened in the middle of the night, when the silence of the prison felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. The air in the cell was stagnant, smelling of damp stone and the iron of the bars. My son entered my cell alone. He didn't come with the guards or the scholars this time. He carried a single document in his hand, his fingers stained with the ink of a bureaucracy that demanded my blood. It was my execution order, a fatwa of death that required only his secondary signature as the family representative to be finalized. He stood there, his shadow long and jagged against the weeping wall, his body trembling with the weight of a regime that was crumbling and a heart that was breaking. I looked at him, not with the disappointment of a father whose legacy was being erased, but with the love of Christ that had found me in the darkness of the night of power. This was the climax of my internal battle, the final temptation to save my physical life by sacrificing my eternal soul. I could see the sweat on his brow in the flicker of the torchlight. "Abbas," he whispered, his voice cracking with a grief he could no longer hide behind his government title. "Please, I beg of you, sign the recantation. Don't make me do this. Don't make me the one who kills my own father." I stood up from the cold floor and walked to the bars. I didn't even look at the paper. I looked into his eyes, seeing the boy I used to carry on my shoulders. I began to pray for him, right there in the dirt and the dark. I didn't pray for my release. I prayed for his soul. I prayed for the burdens of power that were crushing him, and for the son I had failed by not showing him the true face of God sooner. And I told him that I loved him more than my own life, but that I loved the truth more than the sun that rose over the desert. His resolve began to waver, the paper fluttering in his hand like a dying bird. He saw that I was ready to die, not with a cry of war or a curse for my enemies, but with a prayer of peace for my executioner. The internal battle was won. The victory was in the total surrender to the will of the Father. At that moment, I realized that my death would be the loudest sermon I ever preached. Just as he turned to leave, unable to meet my gaze any longer, a wave of chaos erupted outside in the streets of Mecca. The city was in an uproar. News of the Grand Imam's vision had spread like wildfire through the secret channels of the youth. The ground seemed to shake with the footsteps of thousands. In the confusion of the shifting power, the shouting of guards, and the distant sounds of protest, a door was left unlocked, perhaps by a guard whose heart had been touched by my testimony, or perhaps by an angel of the Lord. I didn't care which. I walked out into the cool night air, a man who had died to his old self and been born again in the same night. I was a fugitive, stripped of everything the world valued, but I was finally, truly free. The shadow of the sword was gone, replaced by the light of the morning star. My son stood in the corridor, the unsigned paper on the floor. We looked at each other for one last second, and for the first time, I saw a spark of the same hunger in his eyes. I turned and vanished into the shadows of the city, led by a spirit I finally knew by name. I find myself now in a new underground reality. I am far from the marble palaces and the scent of expensive oud that defined my former life. I am in a small nondescript room in a city whose name I cannot speak. I have lost my titles, my wealth, my palace, and the country I called home for nearly 60 years. I am a fugitive, a man with nothing in the eyes of the Saudi state. Yet, as I sit in this hidden room, lit by the glow of a single lamp, I am surrounded by a new family of believers. There is a young student who risked everything to find me, a former soldier who once guarded the very gates I fled, and an elderly woman who has prayed in secret for 40 years for a day like this. We are all united by the blood of the Lamb, a bond thicker than the lineage of kings. We break bread together in the shadows, and it tastes sweeter than any feast I ever had as a sheikh at the royal table. I look over the desert at sunrise from a small barred window, and I see a beauty I was blind to for 58 years. I see the hand of the Creator in the shifting sands in the morning light. I was once a Grand Imam, a master of the law, but I was a slave to fear, performance, and the crushing weight of a silent God. Now, I am something infinitely greater. I am a son of the living God. The cost of discipleship is high, and for many of us in the Islamic world, it is the cost of everything we have ever known. But the reward is a life that can never be taken away, and a peace that no regime, no prison, and no fatwa can shatter. I am 58 years old, and my life has just begun. If you are watching this, and you are tired of the rules that never bring rest, tired of the suffocating weight of religious fear, and tired of the void that 50 years of ritual could never fill, look to the light that broke into my cage. He is not a Western God. He is the King of the human heart. He is waiting for you in the quiet of your room, ready to bring you into the dawn of a life that never ends. Do not fear the loss of your world. Fear the loss of your soul. My name is Abbas, and I have finally found the way, the truth, and the life. I am no longer a shadow performing for the crowds. I am a witness to the sun. May the grace and the radical, unearned love of the Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. The desert is blooming, and the King has arrived. Amen.